Onward to Philip I. From 1061 to 1066. The first years of the minority of Philip were disturbed by a revolt of the Gascons, who refused to acknowledge the authority of the regent. But the vigour and prudence displayed by Baldwin in reducing the rebels to submission not only gave new lustre to his reputation, but secured him universal obedience, the more durable as it was founded on esteem. The territories of Geoffrey Martel, Count of Anjou, were disputed by his two nephews, Geoffrey and Fulk, and the cautious integrity of the former was ensnared by the perfidious artifices of the latter. Baldwin, however, intent on preserving tranquillity in the dominions of his ward, forbore to interfere in their quarrel, on the termination of which Fulk, the successful competitor, sought to obtain the protection of Philip by the cession of the cession of the Gastoninois, the ceasing of the Gastoninois. But notwithstanding the attention of Baldwin to the interests of the king and the general welfare of the nation, his admiration has not totally escaped censure. He has been accused of neglect in suffering so dangerous a neighbour as the Duke of Normandy to extend the limits of his dominions and to achieve the important conquest of England. It was scarcely possible, however, that Baldwin could foresee the fatal consequences of this event, nor do we think that he could have been justified in exposing the nation to the inevitable dangers of war, by which an attempt to prevent the Norman prince from acquiring a new kingdom, which it was natural to suppose would render him less anxious to extend his native dominions. Be that as it may, the reduction of England by William gave rise to a series of bloody and destructive contests, which always contributed to the exhaust and frequently threatened to subvert the monarchy of France. As from this revolution, the wars and negotiations of the French and English have been indissolubly blended, and form one great and complicated system, a system of politics. It will be necessary to take a cursory view of its rise, progress, and accomplishment. In England, the distinction of the Danes and the restoration of the Saxon line had been effected by the accession of Edward the Confessor, who was son to Ethelred, by Emma, sister to Richard, Duke of Normandy. This weak but pious monarch, in the year 1043, married Editha, daughter to the potent Earl Godwin, but the hatred which he bore to the father was unfortunately transferred to the unoffending child, and though Editha is represented by contemporary writers as possessed of all the graces of personal beauty and endowed with every virtue that can adorn the female mind, she never could acquire the confidence and esteem of her unnatural husband. It is even with his wife, it is even averted that he never consummated the marriage, but abstained from all connection with his wife in consequence of a pretended vow of chastity, which excited the praise and admiration of the monks, and contributed not a little to procure him the title of saint and confessor. This strange and unjustifiable conduct was attended with fatal effects. Edward, having no children, the ambition of the English nobles was roused, and Harry, the brother of Editha, who was equally distinguished for his power and talents, secretly formed the most judicious schemes for securing his succession to the throne. But the king, apprised of his intention and inexpressibly hurt at the idea of being succeeded by an heir of a family whose power had been built on the ruins of regal authority, adopted a plan which seemed to promise an effectual disappointment to his projects. Though his natural affection for the Normans, among whom he passed his youthful days, had led him to wish that Duke William might succeed him, he was now fearful that such an appointment would prove favourable to the pretensions of Harold, by affording the people who were averse from the domination of foreigners to specious pretext for supporting the claims of their favourite. For this reason, he judged it more prudent to fix on his nephew, Edward, surnamed the Exile, the son of Edmund Ironside, for his successor, whom was the only remaining heir of the Saxon line, and whose title could not have admitted of a dispute, since it was preferable to that of Edward himself. This prince, indeed, would have succeeded to the throne on the death of Hardicanute, had he not, by his continual residence from his infancy in a country so remote as Hungary, so entirely estranged himself from the English that they regarded him as a foreigner, and therefore gave the preference to Edward the Confessor. He arrived in his native country in the year 1057, after an absence of 40 years, but unhappily died within a month after his arrival, leaving an infant son named Edgar Atheling. Thus the fears of the king, which had been dispelled by the arrival of his nephew, were renewed by his death, and he was constrained to look out for another successor. He was plainly perceived that the youth and inexperience of Edward would be able to form but a feeble opposition to so popular and powerful a rival as Harold. In this extremity, he again cast his eyes on William, Duke of Normandy, whose talents and power, he was induced to hope, would enable him to surmount every obstacle that might be opposed to his succession. At this period, William had, by his valour and perseverance, expelled all daring pretenders to the ducal crown, and reduced his turbulent and imperious barons to due submission, compelled them to sacrifice their mutual animosities and to the public tranquillity, and established his sovereignty on the firmest basis. In a most rigorous administration of justice, he displayed the natural severity of his temper, which was well adapted to restrain the impetuosity of subjects whom lenity could not soothe to obedience. So no leniency there, cannot soothe to obedience. But from the success which attended this plan of government in his Norman dominions, William was unfortunately led to believe that its excellence was not local, but universal, and therefore established as a maxim that inflexibility of conduct was the first duty of a sovereign. Though Edward was fixed in his determination that William should succeed him, yet fearful to promote disturbances by an open avowal of his intentions, he never put them in execution. Harold, whose hopes, which had been damped for a time, were now revived by the death of the lawful heir, openly proceeded to pursue the most effective measures for the increase of his popularity and the establishment of power. There was one obstacle, however, in his way to the throne, which it seemed difficult to remove. Earl Godwin, when restored to his fortune and honours, had given hostages for his peaceful and loyal demeanour, and among the rest was a son named Ulnorth, and a grandson named Haquin, whom Edward, for greater security, had consigned to the custody of the Duke of Normandy, at whose court they were still detained. Though Harold did not know that the Duke was his competitor, yet he was still anxious to procure the liberation of his brother and nephew, from an apprehension that William might, in favour of Edgar Atheling, retain these pledges to operate as a check on the ambitious pretensions of any other claimant. He therefore represented to the king that as Godwin was dead, there could be no reason for their farther detention. I know it sounds like father, doesn't it? Their farther detention, the distance of detention, particularly as his own conduct had afforded the strongest testimony of unfeigned submission to royal authority, and the most perfect attachment to his prince and devotion to the service of his country. But Edward, though incessantly he was importuned on the subject, steadily refused to comply with his entreaties, alleging that his application should not be addressed to him, but to the Duke of Normandy, in whose possession the hostages were, and Harold, at length, perceiving that all attempts to obtain a more satisfactory answer would prove unavailing, desired the king's permission to make a voyage to the continent, that he might have an opportunity of soliciting the Duke in person and endeavour to obtain from him the release of his kinsman. Okay. This request was perfectly consonant with the king's wishes, who did not doubt that William would find some specious pretext for detaining him in Normandy, or at least that he would take such measures as would effectually prevent Harold from opposing any obstacle to his design. Having obtained the king's consent, Harold, wholly ignorant of his intentions in favour of William, and consequently unsuspicious of the danger he was about to incur, made immediate preparations for his departure, and embarked for Rouen with a numerous and splendid retinue. But being driven by a tempest on the coast of Picardy, he was compelled to take refuge in a port situated in the territories of Guy, Count of Ponthieu, who, being apprised of his quality, ordered him to be detained as a prisoner, and he demanded an exorbitant price for his ransom. Fortunately, Harold found means to convey intelligence of his situation to the Duke of Normandy, to whom he represented that the vicious disposition of the Count of Ponthieu had compelled him to take an unfair advantage of a misfortune which had befallen him, as he was proceeding to the court of Normandy in execution of a commission from the King of England. The importance of this incident immediately struck William in the most forcible point of view. He foresaw that if he could gain Harold, either by threats or promises, he should encounter no farther obstructions in his way to the throne, and Edward might then execute, without fear of danger or dread of opposition, those intentions which he entertained in his favour. He therefore dispatched a messenger to the Count of Ponthieu to demand in a peremptory note the liberation of his prisoner, and that nobleman, not daring to incur the displeasure of so powerful a prince, delivered Harold into the hands of his emissary, who conducted him to Rouen. William received Harold with every possible demonstration of respect and the most cordial marks of friendship, but being acquainted with his ambitious projects, he was at a loss in what manner to proceed, whether to destroy him as a dangerous competitor, or to secure him as a powerful friend. By the adoption of the first measure, he must have made a premature declaration of his own views, which it was his interest to conceal. Besides, the destruction of a nobleman so universally esteemed might have occasioned a rupture between the English and Normans, which must have entirely frustrated any measures the king might wish to pursue, in order to ensure him the succession, and, had Edward died during the war, it was even possible he should leave the kingdom to a prince by whom it was actually attacked. Harold, moreover, being entrusted with the government of Wessex and Kent, all the forts in the southern parts of the island were in possession of his immediate dependents, who would doubtless defend them to the last extremity against his assassin. A circumstance alone sufficient to create a formidable obstruction to the designs of the Duke. These considerations, added to the uncertainty of the advancement which Harold had made in the affections of the English, and consequently of the probability that probability that existed of succeeding in his attempts, induced William to adopt the less desperate mode of endeavouring to ensnare his friendship, though it was liable to objections equally valid and was attended with equal danger, for by communicating his intentions to Harold, he afforded him an ample opportunity of defeating him. He was willing, however, to believe that by so extraordinary a proof of his confidence he should excite the generosity of Harold to make a suitable return, and therefore, after evincing a disposition to comply with his request, in delivering up the hostages, he took an opportunity of disclosing to him the important secret of his pretensions to the crown of England, and of the will which Edward intended to make in his favour. This discovery was followed by the expression of an earnest desire that Harold would assist him in establishing his claims, and by a solemn assurance that in return for so great an obligation he would comply with the suggestions of an unbounded gratitude in supporting the present unrivalled grandeur of Harold and his family, which, he remarked, would with difficulty sustain itself against the jealous and inveterate aversion of Edward, but could not fail to receive a considerable increase from a successor, who would be so highly indebted to him for his elevation. He gave him to understand at the same time that he was not unacquainted with his own ambitious views, and endeavoured to impress his mind with a just sense of the extreme difficulty with which an attempt to obtain his ends would be infallibly attended. To divert Harold from his purpose, he expressed to him, in the strongest terms, the determined opposition he must naturally expect to incur, as well from Edgar Atheling as from the English nobility, who would not fail to regard his ambition with an eye of jealousy. He made use of an argument still more forcible by plainly telling him, should fortune prove so far favourable as to enable him to surmount every other obstacle, he would still find a resolute enemy in himself, who was amply possessed of every requisite for undertaking a long and obstinate contest, and whom no consideration of danger or difficulty could deter from enforcing a claim which he conceived to be founded in justice. In short, he observed to him that by affording his assistance he might secure an extent of power equalled by none but the royal authority. Whereas if he rejected his proffered friendship, he hazarded the loss of a certain and established advantage for an uncertain and precarious prospect of aggrandizement. I know this is not what you wanted if you were a barbarian trying to invade England right now, but that's really what was going on in the with all of this discussion in the background. Harold, though infinitely surprised at the Duke's declaration, possessed sufficient presence of mind to be sensible of the danger he should incur by a peremptory refusal to favour his pretensions. He therefore feigned to be convinced by the reasons which the Duke had alleged to deter him from the pursuit of his project, and assuming a tone of hypocrisy justly adapted to the occasion, confessed to William, with a plausive appearance of candour, that before the arrival of Prince Edward, as the king was without heirs, he had indeed entertained hopes of succeeding to the crown, from a consciousness that there was no nobleman in England whose wealth and services could give him so just a claim to the affection and obedience of the people, that in consequence of such hopes he had even proceeded to take certain measures which had afforded him the fairest prospect of success. But that arrival of the lawful heir to the throne had induced him to change his intentions, as he had been anxious to receive the crown as a free gift of the people, and not to seize it as a usurper. He added that since he was acquainted with the pretensions of William and the pleasure of his sovereign, he should think it his duty to promote them, and he would much rather that the kingdom should fall under the dominion of a prince who was able to defend it than under that of a child whose infant imbecility gave but little hopes of improvement. William, to attach him more firmly to his interest, offered him one of his daughters in marriage. But the princess not being yet arrived at years of maturity, the consummation of the marriage was deferred to a future period. He also required Harold to take a solemn oath to adhere strictly to the promise he had made, in order to render it more sacred and binding. Had recourse to an artifice which conveys a just idea of revered martyrs, just idea of the ignorance and superstition of the times. He ordered the relics of some of the most revered martyrs and saints to be privately conveyed beneath the altar on which Harold had consented to swear, and when the oath was taken, expose them to his view, with such an earnest exhortation to observe most religiously an engagement contracted under such auspices, and ratified by so tremendous a sanction. The Duke then dismissed him, with greater professions of friendship and future protection. Having first delivered to him his nephew Haquin, and promised to bring over his brother Ulnoth when he should go to England himself. Harold was no sooner at liberty than he conceived himself authorized to violate an oath, which had been extorted by fear, and which, if fulfilled, might tend to operate the subjection of his native country to the domination of a foreigner. He determined to take advantage of the confidence that had been reposed in him, and more effectually to frustrate the designs of the Duke of Normandy. He exerted the utmost diligence and assiduity in increasing the numbers of his partisans, and spared no pains to secure the esteem of the people. If hitherto he had really experienced any scruples of conscience from an attempt to usurp the crown to the exclusion of the lawful heir, he now conceived himself to be totally exempt from any imputation of injustice to Edgar Atheling, as even should he forego his pretensions, the succession of that prince would he effectually be impeded by the interposition of William. He therefore strenuously endeavoured to reconcile the minds of the English to his own elevation to the regal dignity. He revived their ancient aversion to the Normans, and by an ostentatious display of his influence and power fought to deter the wavering and timorous England from executing an intended will in favour of his Norman competitor. The king, advanced in years and oppressed with infirmities, made no attempt to counteract his projects. Accordingly, on his death, which happened at the commencement the year 1066, the crown was, by the unanimous voice of the people, conferred on Harold, who proved himself worthy to wear it, by a display of wisdom, vigour, moderation, and justice, that promised to secure the happiness of his subjects and the welfare of the state. The Duke of Normandy, enraged at the success of his rival, made a vow that he should experience the most dreadful effects of his indignation, but that his attempt might be sanctioned by some colour of justice. He sent ambassadors to England to reproach Harold with a violation of his oath, and to demand, in a peremptory tone, the immediate resignation of the throne which he had usurped, threatening him with immediate war in case of a refusal. To this insolent summons Harold justly replied that William could have no possible pretensions to the crown of England, that if the late king had really made a will in his favour, it could be of no effect, as the laws of the land expressly forbade him to dispose of the liberties of his subjects according to the suggestions of his own caprice, and that they had expressly provided against the succession of a foreigner, that for his part the crown had been conferred on him by the unanimous suffrages of the people, whose favour he should deserve to forfeit, where he capable of betraying the dearest interests of the nation which had been consigned to his care. That with regard to the oath, with the violation of which his ambassadors had dared to upbraid him, he had been extorted by a well-grounded fear of personal violence, and could, therefore, never be regarded as obligatory. Finally, he gave the Duke to understand that if he made any attempt to enforce his claim, he would find the English ready to defend their liberties to the last extremity, under a monarch who, conscious of the importance of the trust reposed in him, was determined that his reign should end but with his life. William, on receiving this resolute answer, made the most formidable preparations for war. Though fully aware of the dangers that must inevitably attend this important enterprise, he suffered the voice of prudence to be silenced by the dictates of resentment, and substituting ambition for justice, determined to surmount every obstacle that should be opposed to his progress. He founded his hopes of success on the consideration that the long period of tranquillity which England had enjoyed for the space of near half a century must have essentially enervated its inhabitants, that the English soldiers must be consequently devoid of discipline, and the officers of experience. He knew that the kingdom was wholly unprovided with fortified towns, which afforded an opportunity of prolonging a war, and that one decisive action must, therefore, determine its fate. He was moreover willing to believe that as Harold had ascended the throne in direct opposition to the will of the late monarch, he was not so firmly seated in it, but that the least commotion might occasion a revolt that would prove fatal to his authority. Impressed with these ideas, he hastened the equipment of his fleet, and the same of the intended invasion being already diffused over the neighbouring kingdoms. Great numbers of powerful noblemen, allured by the reputation which William had acquired by his military conduct, repaired to his standard, accompanied by their vassals and dependents. But Conan, Count of Brittany, who was avowed enemy of William, embraced his favourable opportunity of advancing a frivolous claim to the Duchy of Normandy, which he prepared to enforce by marching a powerful army into the Norman territories. The Duke, aware that a defeat at the present critical period must effectually frustrate his designs upon England, proposed terms of accommodation to the Count. But these being rejected with disdain, William was compelled to prepare for deciding the dispute by the sword. And as the two armies were nearly equal in numbers, a desperate engagement was expected to ensue. When the death of Conan, who died suddenly, very opportunely prevented the effusion of blood. Some historians affirm that this nobleman was poisoned by his chamberlain at the instigation of William, an assertion which acquires a great semblance of probability from a due consideration of all the relative circumstances, though it is not sufficiently ascertained to enable us to vouch for its authenticity. Hoel, the brother-in-law and successor of Conan, deviated from the prudent policy of his predecessor, and not only concluded a peace with the Duke of Normandy, but sent his eldest son, Hélène Fergien, to join him with a body of 5,000 Bretons. The Counts of Anjou, Poitou, Maine, Pictou, Maine, and Boulogne also engaged to supply him with troops and transports, on condition of being repaid for their services by a stipulated portion of land after the conquest of England. It's not a secret anymore, is it? William had even the audacity to apply for assistance to France, and Baldwin, rather through fear than friendship, permitted him to levy troops in the dominions of Philip, and even supplied him with a sum of money. Henri IV, Emperor of Germany, not only gave permission to his vassals to embark in this expedition, on which the eyes of all Europe were fixed, but solemnly engaged to protect the Duchy of Normandy from insult or invasion during the absence of William, who was thereby enabled to employ his whole force in the enterprise. But an ally of still greater importance, whom William had found the means of winning over to his interest, was the Pope, whose influence on the minds of the people in those days of darkness and superstition was immense. Far from confining his cares to the due performance of his spiritual duties and the salutary regulation of his church, this aspiring prelate assumed the right to interpose in all secular transactions and to act as a despotic arbiter in the disputes of monarchs, not merely with the laudable view of enforcing harmony, but too frequently for the malignant purpose of lighting the torch of discord and affording a sanction to injustice. Alexander II, who now enjoyed the papal dignity, highly pleased by William's appeal to his tribunal and his offer to hold the kingdom of England as a salve for the apostolic see, determined to espouse his quarrel, hoping too by that means to extend his influence to England, which still maintained a certain degree of independence in its ecclesiastical government, and had hitherto strenuously resisted those exorbitant claims by which the grandeur of the papacy was supported. Urged by these potent considerations, without giving himself time to investigate the justice and validity of William's claim, he openly declared in favour of it, and to inspire the Normans with confidence, sent the Duke a consecrated banner, a golden agneau de, and one of St. Peter's hairs, one of his hairs set in a ring, while on the other hand he attacked his adversary Harold with the artillery of the church, denouncing excommunication against him and all his adherents. So now we have the papacy of Rome supporting William the Conqueror. This goes on and on, so I'm going to stop right there for today, or for this session.